We'll just wait another minute or two and we'll get started. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's event. My name is Michael Berry. I am the director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. And I want to begin by thanking all of our audience members for all of your support over the last couple of months. This is our final event of the fall semester. And so I'm so delighted that you're all here with us and that we have such a distinguished speaker to close out our series of fall lectures. Today, we have the great honor of welcoming Professor Richard Pena from Columbia University. Professor Pena is a professor in the Film and Media Studies at Columbia, where he specializes in film theory and international cinema. Besides being a leading scholar in film studies, he is also well known as the Director Emeritus of the New York Film Festival. So from 1988 all the way through 2012, he was the one who oversaw the incredible programming each year at the New York Film Festival, usually every September. And it was in that capacity that he brought together so many incredible films and filmmakers and programs, retrospectives on artists from ranging from Antonioni to King Hu, from Robert Aldrich to Fei Mu, from Ozu to Oshima, just such a range of kind of a cinematic banquet that he brought to New York each year for so long. And I know I benefited from that during my years in New York incredibly. He also is responsible for putting on so many retrospectives on various national cinemas, including Cuban cinema, Polish cinema, Hungarian cinema. He's probably better versed in world cinema history than probably almost any other film scholar that I know. And so it's just so great that he's willing to share his insight on Chinese cinema today with us. He is also a frequent lecturer on film internationally. From 2014 to 2015, he was visiting professor in Brazilian studies at Princeton. In 2015 to 2016, he was a visiting professor in film studies at Harvard. He has also taught at the Sorbonne, Beijing University, University of Sao Paulo, and he is the recipient of the Cathedra Bergman Award from Mexico City, where he offered a 3-part series on the margins of American cinema. And finally, he'll even host his own TV show on WNET Channel 13's weekly Reel 13. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my former advisor, believe it or not, from our old days at Columbia. And those of you who have taken my classes in film, they probably don't realize how much inspiration I got from Professor Pena over the years and how much of that influenced my own teaching and approach to film studies. So it's just such a treat to be reunited with you here on Zoom. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to Professor Pena.
Great. Thank you, Michael, so much for that extraordinarily generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to have been asked to speak about this. As Michael mentioned, I had a kind of dual career. I mean, now I'm only an academic, but for many years, I also worked in film programming. And one of the things as a film programmer that really often came from my work as an academic was my encountering what you could call black holes in film studies, which was somehow just areas of film study about which you could find very little writing. To give you an example, years ago, I was preparing a lecture on the new German cinema, Fassbinder and Herzog and all that crew. And I thought, well, let me read up a little bit about before then what was going on. And I was amazed how most history books sort of went from the 1930s to the 1960s or 70s without nothing in between. So that led me to be interested in that. And eventually I wound up doing a large series when I was at Lincoln Center that looked at German cinema from 1949 to 1961, after the war, before the wall was the title of it. And again, I discovered that indeed there was a very active and interesting cinema. Our topic today comes a little bit from that. I myself discovered Chinese cinema in the early 1980s. Sadly, as you'll soon realize, I don't speak Chinese, so please forgive any terrible pronunciations that I might make. But I was really intrigued by this extraordinary wealth of cinema that we began seeing, not only in terms of contemporary work, but the more and more older work that we saw. So I made it my business to try and learn as much as I could about that. And the work that came from the pre-1949 period, that was, I want to say, well known, but at least it was circulated. There were a number of major series in different cities that went on, so we got to really see a lot of pre-1949 work. And of course, by the mid-1980s, there was the wonderful flow of first to fifth generation films, and then later generation films and whatever, so that contemporary filmmaking, the PRC, not to mention Taiwan and Hong Kong, became more and more available. But again, there was this black hole. Somehow after 49 up until Yellow Earth, nothing happened, or at least nothing that we had the access to happened. So as I began to read and study more, I learned about the notion of the 17 years of this period that went from 1949 to 1966, from the victory of the People's Liberation Army to the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution, and learned what a unique period this was within Chinese culture and life. So after a while, I proposed a series of this. It took a long time to do, to convince the Chinese that this was really a good idea and things. But anyway, we finally did do a large series about that at Lincoln Center. And again, I think it was a way of really, for me, filling in the gaps of my own knowledge about Chinese cinema, how what went on before 49 informed that, and how what happened from 49 to 66 would in fact inform the cinemas that would continue after that. So I think I'm going to switch now to PowerPoint and begin talking a little bit about that. We'll also see a few clips along the way. And of course, I look forward to, in the end, having some time for discussion and questions and answers. So, name of this is A New Cinema for a New China, Films of the 17 Years, being offered at the UCLA Center for Chinese Studies in 2021. Oops. Okay, always like to start with a map of China. I'm sure most of you don't use it, but when I teach at Columbia, I always find it's very important so that people just remember the location of major cities or provinces. Okay, the creation of the People's Republic. From 49 to 66, as I'm sure many of you know, is a period which within China and Chinese studies is known as the 17 years, a period that's bracketed by the founding of the PRC and the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution. It's, I think, a very interesting period to study because it was truly the period in which basic structures of government and economy were laid down in China. Things that would, of course, have a very long-lasting effect. Also during this period, a lot of essential conflicts within the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and China emerged. So we have, of course, by 49, the end of the Civil War and the creation of what was called the United Front. Again, actual support for the CCP was somewhat limited, especially in the coastal cities. Remember, it was a movement that came from Yan'an in the northwest towards the coast. And in a way, while there were many people anti-Kuomintang and sympathetic in a very general way to the movement of the People's Liberation Army, there wasn't necessarily a lot of support for the communists per se. In 1950, the party sets up the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPCC, and it brought together actually quite a broad spectrum within China. A lot of people from non-CCP groups, obviously nobody from the Kuomintang, and other interest groups. And together they tried to come up with what they called a common program. Now, the common program would declare China a dictatorship of people's democracy. It described the United Front as a kind of combination, an alliance of peasants, workers, petty bourgeoisie and nationalist bourgeoisie. It's interesting if you think of a film like Crows and Sparrows, made right on the edge of the transition to the PLA. That's really the united front that's offered there as well. Freedom of speech, press were guaranteed. Women were granted or guaranteed equal rights, including in marriage. Ethnic minorities were granted equal rights. And this will become an important theme in what I'll be talking about with regards to cinema. And there was a kind of federal structure created with local assemblies that fed into a national assembly, and each had the power to enact national legislation. Many of these weren't realized, but we'll see some of the reasons why. Now, we can ask, how serious were the CCP's United Front politics? They really did spend a lot of time on negotiations and organizing this. And Zhou Enlai, in many ways the number two within the party, was actually involved in just about every stage. That's a symbol of some seriousness. And indeed, in party publications, there was a lot of praise for what was going on. On the other hand, at the same time as the Common Program, there were massive political campaigns against Kuomintang traitors, which led to trials and incarcerations, and in some cases, even murder. Mao openly supported this operation, but again, as always, there seemed to be a double edge. Now, of course, kind of simultaneous with this was the outbreak of the Korean War. So we know in June of 1950, Kim Il-sung crosses the 38th parallel and invades what should have been designated South Korea. Again, you know the story, the UN troops counterattack, and China, of course, entered on the side of the North, and in fact, had tremendous losses. Close to about 900,000 men and women were lost in those battles. China also during this time was denied membership in the United Nations, the seat that had been created for China on the Security Council, going instead to Taiwan, the Republic of China. It became increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union, and of course, repression of internal dissidents increased. People like Gao Gang, Hu Feng, and others found themselves in prison or worse. Now, it's interesting to maybe think of the Chinese Revolution in kind of comparison to other revolutions. If you look at Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, 1918 was followed by what was called the White Rebellion, which was a rebellion by Tsarist officers, supported in large part by a lot of foreign armies, even some American soldiers who were sent there to try and put down the Bolshevik Revolution. That led to a real hardening of the Soviet Communist Party. In Cuba, you have the Cuban Revolution, which is victorious on New Year's Eve of 1959, then the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and that leads to a hardening of the Cuban Communist Party. In Iran, if we look at the Islamic Revolution, you have almost immediately after the declaration of the Islamic Republic, the Iran-Iraq War, which led to a hardening of the power of the mullahs. In a certain way, what happens with China is not different. Whatever the sort of initial broad spectrum, broad program that the Chinese communists seemed to propose in 1950, in a certain way, the Korean War and these snubs like at the UN and whatever led to a hardening of the party and in many ways a kind of cancellation of what had been the broader program. Now, it's interesting too, let me go back for a moment. If we look at all of these revolutions, all of them within the next 10 years would really create important cinemas. The Bolshevik Revolution, of course, would lead to the work of people like Eisenstein and Dovzhenko, so many extraordinary films. The Cuban Revolution, by the end of the 60s, would produce a whole bevy of really interesting, challenging works that were praised internationally. And of course, the Iranian Islamic Revolution would, in fact, lead to eventually kind of to the acceptance and discovery of new Iranian cinema, people like Abbas Kiarostami and Mohsen Makhmalbaf and so many great filmmakers. Curiously, none of these countries prior to their revolution had significant cinemas. There was film activity, of course, but not cinemas that one could say were really seen as a major part of the overall cultural scene, if you will, within those countries. China, it wasn't like that. China, in fact, begins in 1949 with a Chinese cinema, at least a Shanghai-based cinema, that is quite popular and quite well established. So it's interesting to compare those different revolutionary experiences in terms of the cinemas that would develop. Now, for Chinese cinema, the question that really, in a way, ran across all discussions of cinema was what kind of cinema for the new China? Now that China has stood up, as Mao Zedong was to say in October of 1949, what would its cinema look like? Now, again, remember, in the case of the Soviet Union, in the case of Cuba, somewhat in the case of Iran, you were almost starting from scratch. Not exactly, but in a certain way, there weren't national cinemas that were important. China already had a cinema, that was functioning well, and even a cinema that was very supportive of the PLA and of the Communist Party. So, should you simply allow the cinema or the arts in general to take their course? Curiously, during earlier negotiations, right after the end of World War II, it was the Kuomintang that called for the nationalization of cinema. That is, to make cinema part of the government, that the government would control every aspect of cinema, as happened in the Soviet Union, and of course would soon be happening in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and all the countries of the so-called Soviet bloc. In fact, those proposals were also entertained quite seriously in countries like France, countries like Norway, and many other places. The CCP, on the other hand, resisted that calls for nationalization. They were against the idea of nationalizing the cinema. Now, the beginnings of the cinema and the PRC, as I mentioned, happened into a fairly booming industry. 1946 to 49 is sometimes called the second golden age of Chinese filmmaking, the first one having been from 31 till 37. And they had, one of the things that marked this period was a significant growth in domestic attendance. If you look at attendance figures for those years, it's fascinating how often the Chinese films outperform American and many other kinds of films. In addition, the Japanese, in Manchukuo, or Manchuria, I should say, left first-rate film studios. The Manchukuo, the Manet film studio, was probably the most advanced film studio in all of Asia. And in fact, that was taken over rather quickly by the communists, as well as the Kuomintang studios in Chongqing. Indeed, the very first PRC production, in a certain way shot before the PRC was born, is a film called Bridge, or Chow, shot in Chongqing in 1949, a kind of very standard film, kind of a film about the relationship between these engineers / intellectuals and the workers, and how the two of them have to come together to create a bridge which will allow forces from the People's Liberation Army to sort of cross over rivers and, of course, continue the fight. In December of 1949, this is just 2 months after the declaration of the People's Republic, the Central Film Bureau is created under the leadership of Yuan Muji. Yuan Muji, of course, had been important figure in the 1931 to 37 Shanghai-based cinema. You might have seen his film Street Angels, one of the most frequently revived of those films. Curiously, as opposed to, again, Cuban cinema, Soviet cinema, not Iran, because Iran has always had private production. In China, it was decided that private production could continue, that not all cinema would come under the aegis of the new PLA government, or the new Communist Party government. Now, in thinking of these years, the 17 years, one, I think, handy way, and I think revealing way to think about the tensions within Chinese cinema is to see the tensions as Shanghai versus Yan'an. Soon after the PLA victory, there are already ideological struggles being felt in intellectual and artistic communities, and of course in cinema as well. And I think this kind of format, this struggle between Shanghai and Yan'an, is very revealing. Now, again, speaking very generally, when we speak of Shanghai, we're talking about a somewhat more open, more cosmopolitan, more flexible sort of group of artists and intellectuals whose attitudes in terms of the characters depicted were much more open. You could have characters who were objectionable, or characters who could be saved or changed. And there was less demands on ideological purity. Again, even though it's a film that straddles those eras, Crows and Sparrows, which at think many of you have probably seen, is a good example of that, a film in which you have characters like the Shaos, the sort of petty street merchants who are still taken into the house of New China at the end of the film, versus Yan'an. And Yan'an, of course, refers to the place in northwestern China where Mao went after the Long March. And of course, many artists and intellectuals joined him there. The Yan'an people were much more associated with the rigid, much more Communist Party Maoist line. Of course, these people had been with Mao and, of course, had already picked up a certain vision in terms of what they imagined the role of culture would be in the new society. Now, if we look at the 17 years, again, that sort of period from 49 to 66, I think you can actually divide the 17 years into 5 periods. And in fact, each period kind of is noted for or defined by the ascendancy of one of these tendencies over the other. Now, again, this is just 17 years, and you have 5 different periods, in my opinion. So you can see, of course, there were a lot of tension, a lot of kind of contradictions. The first period, excuse me, from 49 to 52 is the Shanghai period. This is when private production is still allowed. And of course, the influence of the Shanghai cinema was at its peak. 53 to 56 is really in many ways a reaction to that, a reaction to the nationalization of cinema, and of course, the increasing hardening of the Communist Party line after the Korean War, after the snub of the UN and whatever. 56 to 57, and here the years are awfully fluid, is again a Shanghai period because this was the 100 Flowers period. And that period characterized by Mao's dictum, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend, found its way to the cinema as well, as we'll see it. 58 to 61, we go back to Yan'an, and you could say that this is really a great leap forward period. There's a real spike in production. And of course, one of the things that's most notable is you begin to get cinema being made all over China. The Chinese had begun to build studios in the very different republics, in these sort of minority republics, one can call them, all around the edges of China, and they began to produce films. After the Great Leap Forward's catastrophe and whatever, after the kind of demission of Mao, we go back to a Shanghai period from 62 to 66. I'll go over all of these a little more in detail now. Now, again, please forgive me, the time demarcations are rather loose. I'm speaking at UCLA, a university with a world-famous film school, so you know that movies often take a lot of time, which means, of course, that you could begin a film under one of these regimes and it would be ended or finished in the next one, or even straddle a couple of them. So it's interesting to, again, see these films. Take a film, there's well, I'll talk about it in a minute, a film made of the great classic, The Lin Family Shop, that's really begun during the 100 Flowers period, but it's not finished till 58. So they have to tack on an ending that will, in a certain way, make it more acceptable, because you can't have sympathy for these, bourgeois kind of store owners. Now, from 49 to 52, approximately 96 films were made, and this was really the sort of the Shanghai period. One can, I think, draw lots of lines directly from the pre-49 Shanghai cinema into the PRC films of this period. There's a very large presence of people who've been working in the Chinese cinema from the 30s and 40s, directors, but also actors, many people who had already been involved in what we could think of as a kind of left-wing progressive Chinese filmmaking tradition. Many of the films, or one of the characteristic forms, were these historical chronicles, films that would cover many years and show the changes that were going on in China. For example, the film This Whole Life of Mine, based on the May 4th writer Lao Shu, directed in 1950 by Shi Hui, is a kind of perfect example of that. It basically follows the life of a Beijing policeman from the abdication of the emperor in 1911 all the way to 1946. And of course, this policeman wants to be a good person, or wants to do a good job, but he finds himself many times forced into situations where he is forced to sort of support people and people in power that he otherwise might object to. It's kind of a perfect example of that. Now, all during this period, there continued to be private production, especially from two studios, Kunlun and Wenhua, both of which had been established in the 1940s, and both of which were known for being left-wing studios. Again, they were capitalist enterprises, but the people who worked for these studios were very anti-Kuomintang and very much pro the Liberation Army, without perhaps knowing precisely what that meant. One of the signal incidents of this period was the scandal and debate over a film called The Life of Wu Shun, which begins in 1950, but goes on beyond that. The Life of Wu Shun was based on a popular biography of a man who had been a great 19th century educator. He literally would go around the country begging for money to found schools because he felt that education was the way in which the peasantry could liberate itself. And it was a kind of very prestigious production directed by Sun Yu, who, among other things, once studied at Columbia University, and starred Zhao Dan, the biggest, probably, Chinese male star of that period. And the early notices were very positive. It was a hit. It was really kind of, again, a film that seemed to capture the public. Very interestingly, in February of 1951, the People's Daily published an article called "We Must Continue to Discuss the Life of Wu Shun." Scholars who've looked into this are now fairly convinced that this unsigned article was actually written by Mao. Not perhaps totally written, at least came from Mao's thought in a way. Perhaps some other people actually did the writing. In this article, the author, who is unsigned, argues that the film is really a reactionary film because it proposes reformist policies such as education, as opposed to really looking at incidents of revolutionary action. Within a month of that article, The Life of Wu Shun was taken from circulation, even though it was doing very well in different parts of the country, and that led to an increasing attack on the private studios, that the private studios could not be trusted, that because of that, the government really did have to nationalize cinema. Here's just a still from The Life of Wu Shun. It's, again, a very typical film from the pre-49 period, very, well done historical recreation, and of course, showing you, sort of almost a guide for correct action. So anyway, from 53 to 56, a period in which there were about 89 films, you have the ascendancy of Yan'an. By 1953, all the studios had been nationalized. The owners of Kunlun and the other studios were encouraged to sell their studios to the government. Obviously, they never got whatever their value was, but this was really, in a certain way, implied or suggested to them. And of course, they did it. This period is known for almost having a huge number of war films. World War II, the Civil War against the Kuomintang, and the Korean War were very frequent topics, probably cover more than 2/3 of the films made at this time. There are economic reasons for this. Again, China was still in a very precarious situation, and war films, you had no need of sets or very little need. Props, you had all the props you needed from the Chinese military. These films were largely shot outside. Weapons, uniforms, and also, of course, these were films that had very clear enemies. So the danger of some kind of ideological problem was much less. If you look at a film like Crossing Across the Yangtze River, made in 1954, it's a wonderful example of that, or The Letter Written with a Quill Pen. There are a number of films which come out at this time. There are also a few quite very good films. If you've ever seen Tank Commander Wang, for example, really excellent film sort of made at this time about a tank commander's attempt to save an orphanage. Also during this period, you have the declaration of the first five-year plan, and cinema has a place within that plan, of course. There was a section that dealt with the infrastructural development for cinema. That meant that new laboratories would be built and cinemas would be built. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. This led to the funding for the creation or the expansion of, since they're already in operation, mobile projection units, which would bring movie projection to distant villages, to the countryside, or to factories, or to many places, and create new screening spaces. Another very crucial part of this 5-year plan's area about cinema was the creation of new film studios in the minority republics. In a way, one can see this both as an idea of wanting to create a truly national Chinese cinema, but also an attempt to break the power of Shanghai. Remember, prior to 49, Shanghai and its environs was really the absolute center of Chinese cinema. In fact, scholars like Liu Feng have actually said we should call it more a Shanghai than a Chinese cinema, because Shanghai was so central to the existence of the cinema at that time. Next period up from 56 to 57. Again, these dates are very loose, as I mentioned, about 108 films. This returns us to Shanghai because this is really the 100 flowers period. There are now more open stories. There are even some films that are satires, as we'll see on contemporary life. Remember, in the earlier periods, there was either an accent on kind of historical films or on war films. Now you actually had films which dealt with the everyday life of China in this period after 1949. There was also a kind of return to adaptations of May 4th classics. May 4th had always been problematic for the Chinese Communist Party. On the one hand, it obviously had an enormous effect on Chinese life and consciousness and politics, but on the other hand, there was the air of bourgeois reformism that was attached to it. I happened to be in China on the 100th anniversary of May 4th. I was kind of startled how uncelebrated it was, but maybe I shouldn't have been that startled. It also signaled a return to bigger budget and much more studio-based filmmaking. Remember, a lot of the films in the second period were war films that were often shot on location. So typical of these 100 Flowers films were Before the New Director Arrives, which we'll see a little bit of in a minute. City by Night, a kind of fascinating film about an industrialist who's very, very kind of sympathetic to the aims of the PRC and to the new government. But of course, he's an industrialist. He runs a factory, and how bit by bit he finally realizes that he has to give the factory or whatever over to the government and really become part of the overall new economy. Or the classic Lin family shop, which is a very beautiful story about a family that finds itself going out of business because the sort of materials that they sell can be sold much more cheaply in shops that carry Japanese goods, because Japanese manufacture them more efficiently and whatever. And in fact, what eventually happens is that they have to pretend in a way that, you know, they have stolen so that their daughter and their shop assistant can get away. Very well done, but the film has a coda. And in that coda, it says, well, yes, the Lin family suffered, but of course, the peasants and everybody else suffered a lot more. And then you see sort of signs of more active revolution. You know, it's clearly something that was added on to try and bring the Lin family shop more into sort of, you know, agreement with that idea that we shouldn't worry too much about people from the bourgeois shopkeeper class. Okay, I'd like now to show a brief clip from Before the New Director Arrives. In a way, the film is somewhat an adaptation on Gogol's The Inspector General. If you know that famous play, in that someone is coming to inspect a Russian village, but he arrives unannounced and people don't realize he's the Inspector General. So all these people do and say kind of outrageous things in front of him. And then, of course, at the end of the play, he reveals who he is. That's a little bit what happens here, although the action is really kept in a factory. The man who has become the acting director of this factory is somebody who puts on a certain amount of airs. If he's going to order furniture, he's going to order really good furniture for himself and whatever, and clearly is using his position, not so much to really enrich himself, but to have a little more privilege. Whereas the workers in the factory, as we see, live in often very, very poor conditions, whatever. A new director arrives. He doesn't announce himself. We don't know who he is. We're going to see the very end of the film when the new director finally reveals himself to this man who has been the acting director and who, of course, has been using his position to enrich himself or to, you know, make his life more comfortable. So if we can please see that first clip.
Richard, you just need to stop screen
share.
Sorry.
I'm always sort of bad about these things. So should I go into screen share then? No, I'll let you do it.
I'll take care of it.
Okay, sorry.
And then after the clip, you can turn yours back.
Go back, right.
你是新兴委托商行吗？我问你是新兴吗？照相馆儿，讨厌！总机，你怎么搞的你？啊！我叫你新兴委托商行，你给弄哪儿去了？这是？喂，欣欣吗？我是牛科长啊。我说啊，昨天我们看好那个新钢丝床啊，决定不要了。哎，我们局长睡不惯嘛，所以我们要退啊。刚送走。刚才是点小误会。这个房子嘛，还是要修的啊，要修的。科长，我哪儿都找到了，就是没找到局长。好，你不用管了。哎，你到门口等，待会儿有人送沙发来的话，你把它退回去。怎么退回去？退回去，来回车钱算我们的啊！哎，我是个痛快人，这么办，房子嘛，立刻动工。至于价钱呢，你说多少算多少，怎么样？哎，可是一样，时间得快，限明天交工啊！哎，要是万一来不及的话，其实这个工程上面啊，马虎点也行啊。那行吗？没法子啊，局长的意思嘛。上级这么决定了，那有困难也只好克服了。有件事你可得帮个忙，万一局长要问起修房子事儿呢，先找你来估估价，因为你那活多，忙不过来，所以才拖到现在，明白吗？为什么？嗨，这个机关嘛，人多嘴杂，你说局长新来乍到的，他又不了解情况，万一听些什么闲言乱语啊，会引起一些不必要的误会，对不对？当然了，你帮我这个忙，事后啊，我请客。哦，还吃一顿。没关系，局长嘛，跟我也是老朋友了，彼此都很熟悉。哦，你跟局长是老朋友了？哎，老朋友喽。从前呐，一块打过游击，搞过土改。哎，我这是落后了。你瞧，弄得现在才是那么个科长，话也难说得很呐。哎，我们局长的脾气跟我可不一样啊，他最讨厌商人，你得注意啊。你看，我说在这儿嘛，老李，这么半天不着面，你上哪儿去了？我在楼底下打扫走廊呢。
刘科长，杨会可搬到局长办公室门口了。
什么？谁让你们搬的？是局长叫搬的。什么？局长就在楼下。
你怎么了，牛科长？局长就在这儿，你还到哪儿去找啊？
这就是张局长。张局长，我就是总务科长牛大海。认识，我们不是老朋友了吗？
怎么，局长，你们是老朋友？
是啊，我们一起打过游击，搞过土改，是吧？我实在是没想到。是啊，我也没有想到，我们局里居然有这么一位科长。沙发、床、转椅都送来了，我怎么说呀？他们都不肯退回去。不肯退，那就送我家去得了。怎么送你家去？送我家去。那怎么就叫你送我家去嘛？哎，局长，这个是我的爱人替一个朋友代买的，代买的。哎，进来进来！谁的脸盆？谁的脸盆？哎，我的来来来来，我的来了，这。哎！我说你这干什么？你干什么这是？谁让你们搬的？老崔啊，是这么回事儿。我不让他们搬，他们非搬不可，我有什么法子呢？你看怎么办？你们这简直是造反了，你们！好，我去报告我们科长去。 我说科长，您去看看，这不像话着，这简直是无组织、无纪律行为。他们呢，居然把局长办公室当成了宿舍。您说这叫局长以后怎么办公啊？
哎，这间屋子办公不就很好吗？何必搬到楼下去呢？崔叔啊，你去把门口那木牌子还是翻过来吧。啊。
哎，你在这儿啊？我说一晃你就不见了，你还没填回个证呢，可是。局长。
同志们，我今天本来是上班来的，想不到倒做了一次演员，而且还演的是一幕滑稽戏啊，是可笑啊。可是，在笑完了之后，我们应该好好的想一想，看看在我们中间，像牛科长这样的人，是不是只有一个呢？啊，牛科长。戏是演完了，你这个主角也该下台了吧？
Okay, let me just go back for a second. Many things to talk about that film. Again, in this third period, what I call the 100 Flower cinema, you get really for the first time since 1949, quite a few films that deal with contemporary, that is post-1949 China. And this is a good example. Here, of course, the criticism, which is relatively gentle. The man is not a criminal or a thief, really. He's just somebody who's obviously using his position to sort of benefit himself. The criticism is in a certain way very soft. But what's interesting to me in a certain way is how at the end, the Director General actually appeals to us. He doesn't appeal necessarily to the higher authorities. It's we who see through this character. And again, it's not a problem of the system itself. The system is fine. It's just there can be bad elements within it. So again, while you could say it is a critique, on the other hand, it is, I think, a relatively gentle one, very amusing one. I think it's the film is a lot of fun. The film that Liu Ban would make after this, a film called Unfinished Comedy, is really quite a remarkable film. It's a film in which someone is showing a film to some party officials and keeps changing parts in it and whatever. That film was banned and was never really screened at that time, only became screened actually in the late 1970s. And Liu Ban, after that film, was never allowed to make another film. Okay, going on to the next period, very generally speaking, we can maybe call this the Great Leap Forward cinema. During this period, there were about 180 films made, over about 60 films a year. In 1958 alone, there were 108 films made. Quite a huge leap when you think, for example, that in the first few periods, there was only about 96 films made over 3 or 4 years. Part of the reason for this was the fact that by this time, a lot of those new film studios that had been built, especially in these minority areas, were already functioning. One can also say that by this time, finally, cinema became a national Chinese experience. In 1949, there were only 646 cinemas in all of China, and more than half of them were in Shanghai or the area of Shanghai. By 1959, there were something like 14,000 cinemas. Now, some of these were actual cinemas. Many of them were screening spaces in schools, factories, hospitals, other places like that. So it really is in 1959, in this period, that one could say that cinema finally in China became truly national. During this period, there was a move away from studios to more on location work. There's much more documentary flavored production, and you also begin to get the appearance of some new genre. The most important were really national minority films. And these were films about non-Han communities celebrating their friendship with the Han, who of course are the majority of the Chinese people. Five Golden Flowers by Wang Jiayi, very, very popular film still to this day. Third Sister Liu, Surfs, a very hard and in certain ways awful film made about Tibet. Many films at that time, again, made by these minority communities, which are often set in these kind of edges of China, because that's where many of these minority communities live. For example, in Yunnan, in Guangxi, Guizhou, all this area, many of the films are set here. And of course, it leads to a certain kind of exoticism at the same time. One of the attractions of cinema, of course, has always been to see places or things that you wouldn't encounter every day. And I don't think Chinese audiences were different, but of course, after 1949, they saw very few films from outside of China, some from the Soviet Union, but generally speaking, overwhelmingly, the films people saw were Chinese films. These national minority films did give at least a little taste of a certain kind of exoticism. I'd like to show you now a couple of brief clips from Five Golden Flowers, a kind of really typical example of this sort of film. The basic plot is that, so we're going to see sort of the beginning of the film, but a young man goes to a contest held by the Bao people, one of these minority groups, and there he meets a young woman named Golden Flower, and he's very much taken with her. He comes back a year later hoping to see her again, but in fact, he discovers there are 5 women in this kind of work commune with that name, all of them with different specialties. One of them is a vet, one of them is a geologist, one of them is involved in fishing, and then finally he finds his Golden Flower, who in fact is one of the community's leaders. Let's look, if we can, at those 2 clips from Five Golden Flowers.
We need you to.
Sorry, I keep saying, I should be better at this by now, I tell you. think that was there a second clip on that?
Yeah, I believe so. Let me go back.
有人找你，谁呀？工程队的同志，有什么事儿啊？我不知道，你快去吧。你们找我？
副社长，我们想和您商量一下。你看，我们这儿的工程得突击一下了，这样才能和这几部分工程平衡，不然全部工程就要拖期了。
你们这一工段有多少人呢？
才3个队。
好吧，从武工区给你们调2个队来。
真的？什么时候来？
马上就调。你到工程指挥部去说一下。
好，走吧。
怎么了？机器出点小毛病。
马上就好了。
副社长，你们怎么从老远跑来了？打官司来了。你们俩呀，走，到社管会去谈吧。
Okay, Five Golden Flowers is really a lot of fun in many ways. First of all, those opening shots that we get, really, for, I think, a Chinese public, which like many other publics might be a little starved for a little bit of exoticism, a little bit of romance. These films provide it. You see the very colorful costumes, the very energetic dancing, all those kind of things, but of course, under the watchful banners of the Communist Party. Again, I don't read Chinese, but I can imagine what those banners say. They sort of almost in a certain way become a frame around which we see all these things. One of the things we just saw a tiny bit of is the fact that the film also includes these 2 Han Chinese characters. They actually are coming from a film studio because they're trying to make a film in this region and they're looking for locations. So they come to see the head of the work community and whatever, but they actually find him sleeping. And there's a lot of comedy. It's funny how in this film, a lot of the comedy is built around these 2 Han Chinese characters. We open up, of course, the film with that, incredible sequence of dancing, the markets, but when we actually move further into the film after the visit of these Han Chinese men, we see the whole community that just before we saw dancing and singing and whatever, now very much gainfully involved in the project of the Great Leap Forward. You see literally thousands of people working all together as teams. You get these kind of, unfortunately, I don't have the shot here, but wonderful shot that is there where you see all these people in carts. There's almost a kind of choreography of it. And this woman, in fact, is the golden flower that we're looking for. She doesn't meet her intended until the film, but she's one of the golden flowers. And that we see she's an enormously responsible person. She's the person with whom these officials, again, also Han Chinese, you can, again, members of the party, you can tell by their clothing and things like that, are there to discuss plans with her. So the film does a number of things. It clearly inscribes national minorities into the national Chinese project, more specifically the Great Leap Forward. And of course, is a film that really talks about women, that in these communities, often seen as very traditional or even reactionary, we now have a generation of women who are in charge of major industrial projects. And in fact, all of the 5 golden flowers are women who are working in responsible positions within this work, within this kind of work unit. Again, very interesting film because both entertaining and a way in which certain kind of, I think, ideas of the government, proposals of the government can be very powerfully expressed and dramatized. Other films, such as Third Sister Liu, involved other minority people, and often these films were musicals because they would very much incorporate musical and dance forms as an essential part of the overall spectacle. There are also some films, perhaps a little less well remembered, Serfs, sort of 1962 film, sort of a late entry, is a film about Tibetan people, again, full of terrible images of the Tibetan lamas and how they subjugate people and drink, wine from skulls and do all the kinds of things that became part of that anti-Tibetan fodder that one would read about over the years. There was also another variant, I'll talk about that in a second, which were spy films, but I'll talk about that as I mentioned in a second. After the Great Leap Forward and the changes in the Chinese government, once again, Shanghai came into prominence. The number of films was greatly reduced, especially next to those years of the Great Leap Forward. During this period, there are only 27 films a year made, much, much less. Remember, there was that one year, 1958, with about 108 films. So this is a real concentration, diminution of production. But there was now a much greater emphasis on large productions, really using the full studio and technical might of Shanghai. There's less emphasis during this period on these new studios that had been built in these minority republics. Also, after 1960-61, you'll recall China broke with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And indeed, during this time, almost no foreign films were shown in China. So China, in a certain way, remained in this almost little bit of a petri dish atmosphere, really separated from a lot of other trends that were going on in world cinema at that time. By 1962, perhaps as part of this idea of breaking with outside influence, there's more and more emphasis on how to create a sort of cinefied Chinese film language. It's interesting to really look in the 1960s because not only was this happening in China, but it was happening in Latin America. Filmmakers in Brazil, in Argentina, Cuba. We're talking about a Latin American or third world film language. Similarly, in India, you had filmmakers like Ritvik Ghatak and Bimal Roy who were trying to create film language derived from Indian cultural tradition. So it's a real kind of theme, one could say, in international cinema. Curiously, even though China was not really in great contact with many of these places, there was, in fact, this idea of wanting to cinefy, to make a film language that was more specifically Chinese. One sort of genre which grew up during this time and is related to the national minority films were spy films. There are an enormous number of spy films made at this time, and a lot of them are set among the national minorities. The general plot is that evil forces, generally those of the United States, have somehow been able to influence members of national minority groups to revolt or in some ways subvert the Han Chinese national government. And of course, eventually someone sees the light and, there's a kind of rescue at the end. A film like Visitors from Icy Mountain, very, very interesting film along these lines done among the Mongolian people. Of course, in 1966, all production comes to a halt with the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution. China is, in fact, I believe, the only, to my mind, major filmmaker that ever stopped making films. Every other country we look at, Germany, name it, they always had continuous production. In China, actually, from 67 till 70, there really are no feature films made. There are some documentaries, and eventually there would be films of the model operas. But for a number of years, production simply stopped, in a way because nobody really knew exactly what production should be. Now, I'm almost running out of time, so I'm going to jump up a little bit. I was going to talk a little bit about Chinese opera, but I think probably many of you know that at least as well as I do, probably better. I'm going to talk about a film called Two Stage Sisters, which for me is the greatest film of this period. It's also the film that really got me interested in Chinese cinema, so I always love talking about it. It's by a man by the name of Changjin. Two Stage Sisters uses Shaoxing opera, which is a special kind of opera from an area south of Shanghai. It was very popular in the early 20th century. And as you'll see, well, if you've seen the film, you know the film is set in the 30s and 1940s. The structure of Shaoxing opera is a little bit different from some of the other opera variations within China because it's made up of very long aria-like monologues. And because of that, it often seemed to be better, more adept at being adapted to Western modes of musical theater. Here it is right here. It's right, really this area right below Shanghai is really where this particular opera variant comes from. Now, Changjin was really the finest and really the most famous director to emerge in Chinese cinema during the 17 years. To my mind, he's certainly one of the great figures in Chinese film history, really made a number of fantastic films. Changjin emerged from the Shanghai tradition, that pre-49 tradition. He worked with Zheng Junli, the director of Crows and Sparrows, Xi Hua, and another number of people who, again, came out of that tradition. And finally, in 1954, passes over to becoming a director in his own right. His film, The Red Detachment of Women, was an enormous, perhaps the single most successful film made during the 17 years, and of course, would later become the basis of model operas and things like that. He also made a film right after that. It was actually a film of a play that existed called Big Lee, Ole Lee, and Little Lee. And again, a huge, huge hit. So at this time, you could say that Changjin was really at the height of his creative powers and also in terms of his prestige. And this allowed him to have near total control for Two Stage Sisters, the film he was going to make. Now, again, there's a lot I could say about it. There's Mr. Xie. Wonderful man, lovely, lovely human. I just want to talk a little bit about it before I open it up for questions. Two Stage Sisters was released in 1964 and originally got very good reviews, and the box office for a short period of time was good, but it immediately drew very vicious, criticism from Ching, the wife of Mao Zedong. She labeled the film a poisonous weed, and in fact incited crowds of Red Guards and others actually burned down a 17th century theater that was used in the film. Often when people talk about the Cultural Revolution, they see the banning of this film by such an important and well-placed filmmaker as one of the real instigators of the Cultural Revolution. Here's Ching as a movie star. As you know, she worked in the movies in the 1930s herself, and here's Ching by 1966. Two Stage Sisters really combine two typical narrative structures used in Chinese cinema. The historical passage, a certain way derived from the historical novel, where you basically follow the trajectory of a character through various historical and political changes. I spoke about that with regards to this whole life of mine. Two Stage Sisters does something similar. It goes from 1931 to 1950, and each chapter, 31, 36, 41, 46, 50, brings us to another period of China during that time. Curiously, there's no reference outright to the war. They talk about the war as something different, but you'd never know that much of the film is going on during an absolutely catastrophic war for China. The other thing that this film sort of features is the notion of comparative characters. There are two sisters, and in a certain way, we follow the trajectories of each one. One becomes really a model in terms of her action, her gradual growth of a revolutionary conscience, whereas the other falls into sin and decadent ways and whatever, although is saved at the end. Now, one of the things that really interests me about this film, aside from the fact I think it's extraordinarily beautiful and moving, is that it's a very interesting film in terms of a discourse on art and politics. In many ways, it talks about art through the example of opera. And opera really was kind of a medium that always hung over the history history of cinema within China as a way of how you could adapt opera or film opera, but at the same time, the way in which the aesthetics of opera would influence the aesthetics of Chinese filmmaking. And again, I talk about that idea of the cinefied film language. It's a good place to start to see how you can, in a certain way, take elements from opera and adapt them rather, to cinema. In a sense, what I just want to show you before I end is just the way the two stage sisters, which I'm sure many of you have seen or have access to, I hope, is the way in which the film really gives us three different examples of not just opera, but also its reception. The first view, which we could call the classic style, is the one that's seen most. First, we have a performance interrupted by a runaway bride, police raid, a young landowner who invites the troupe to his home with the hope of seducing one of the actors. And then finally, the fourth view in Shanghai. Here's in the beginning, this is actually the theater that was destroyed by the Red Guards or their followers, because they were so angry about two stage sisters. In a sense, this is the most classical or traditional rendering that we get of Shaoxing opera, but rather than concentrating on that, we see how, in a sense, while this is going on, the oppression of this young woman who we learn is a child bride married to this old man here. In a certain way, this goes on, whereas that classical opera is going on as well. We continue to see it, but now the point of view changes to third master Ni, as he's identified, obviously the son of the local power in a way, who sees the opera not for something that he admires as art, but as a place for sexual conquest. And in fact, he invites the troupe back to his home, and there's a scene in which the women refuse to stay with him. Later on, the two women move to Shanghai. Again, one plays the Shang role, one's the Dan role, the male and the female roles. They perform in a Shanghai theater, but again, their performance is essentially kind of the reason for a certain kind of erotic interest. Mr. Tang, where did you find these two pearls? And Mr. Tang, who's the manager of these two women, says, I hope you'll grace them with your patronage. Very often leading actors in Chinese opera, females, especially probably some males too, would become, in fact, the kind of sponsored, if you will, actors of wealthy people. So again, all of that sort of older tradition is linked with this kind of decadent interest, the way in which it either hides the oppression of women, or we see how it becomes the occasion for people's erotic interest. The second alternative we get in the film is what you might call the May 4th style. Chunhua, the good sister, decides to do an adaptation of Lu Shun's The New Year Sacrifice. The great Lu Shun, of course, the symbol of May 4th in lots of ways, or at least in literature. You know the story. And here we can see that we move from opera that was done in the classical way to a kind of May 4th inflected opera, which clearly brings in many elements of the Huaju, or Western spoken drama, a much more realist set. Here we see, of course, he's the local leader of a communist cell, and Zhang Bo, who I'll talk more about in a minute. You see that it's performed on a regular stage with a proscenium and a curtain, all of those accoutrements that we think of much more for Western style theater. And at the end, the performance is very much excited this young woman, who we later learn is a communist cadre, who comes backstage to congratulate Chunhua, the actress. So it's a kind of intellectual appreciation, if you will, of what she's been doing, that she's done a very important role in kind of dramatizing the condition of women. Finally, we get the third variation towards the end of the film, which we could call the post-49 revolutionary style. After the revolution, Chunhua continues performing, but now with a government-sponsored group. And they actually go and perform in the provinces. In fact, they go back to places they were at the beginning of the film. They perform The White-Haired Girl. Again, sort of a story you probably know about a woman who flees to the countryside after being horribly oppressed. And while hiding, all her hair turns white, and people in the local area think she's a demon. But in fact, in the original, she gets saved by a young hunter. Here, of course, she gets saved by a Communist Party cadre, and that Communist Party group will go after the people who oppressed her. So here we have Chunhua as the white-haired girl. It's interesting because they go back to a much more traditional, highly stylized rendition of Chinese Chinese opera. Here again, with kind of this chase scene, very stylized as they sort of almost run in slow motion. Once again, we have the appearance of this banner, giving almost a frame, if you will. And here, rather than this young hunter, who is the savior in the original story of White-Haired Girl, here, of course, is clearly members of the Communist Party or the People's Liberation Army, who have now arrested the people who oppressed her, and of course will seek vengeance for them. And we see here at this moment when both the local villagers and the Communist Party members looked on the landlords who so terribly oppressed her and her family that she ran into the mountains and eventually became this white-haired girl. And the reaction of the crowd is revolutionary fervor. Now, remember, in the first one, what we see, basically Chinese opera seemed to arouse erotic interest. In the second, a kind of intellectual admiration. But true revolutionary art really arouses revolutionary fervor. We see the audience screaming, yelling out, kill them, judge them, all kinds of things at the end. So interestingly, aside from providing a kind of, I think, wonderful film, we can really see Two Stage Sisters as a kind of précis on artistic practice. That, again, this sort of idea of what kind of cinema for the new China is answered in a way by this film, where Changjin takes opera, in a certain way, such a fundamental part of Chinese culture, and really shows in the course of the film an evolution from a classical style to a kind of May 4th style, and then finally to what we might call a revolutionary style. Okay, there's some more that I could go on about, but I know I've spoken a little too long, so I will stop here. Let me just mention before we go on that this tie here was a present from Changjin, an absolutely wonderful man. And whenever I speak about him, I always like to wear it. He was a great guy. And one time when he was coming to New York and I saw him, he gave me this tie. So I'm always very proud to wear it. Okay, I'd be pleased to answer any questions or hear any comments you had about anything I said.
Thank you, Professor Pena, for not only a wonderful talk, but really a kind of masterclass in the cinema of the 17 years. And I want to, again, encourage our audience members, if you have questions, there's a chat box where you could type it. And I would love to have actual voices from the audience. So I'm going to try to pull some of you who ask questions into our virtual stage so we can hopefully see and hear you when you ask your questions. Of course, if you prefer, just let us know and we'll read the question. But I think it'll be great if we can make this as interactive as possible. To get us started, I wanted to just ask you a question about an almost sense of strange deja vu that I was getting as you were talking about this period, this bygone era from all these years ago, and thinking about what's happening right now in Chinese cinema. You talked about the interaction a lot between art and politics. You talked about the first 5-year film plan all the way back in 1953. You talked about this Yan'an period, this ebbs and flows between Yan'an periods and Shanghai periods. I mean, we just had a new 5-year plan released a couple weeks ago for the Chinese film industry. Politics are becoming increasingly prevalent in recent Chinese films. The Battle of Changjin Lake is now the most profitable film in Chinese film history. I think it's probably the most profitable film of the year globally. And it's a Korean War film, not unlike some of those films that you talked about. And in some ways, it almost feels like the last 2 or 3 years, we're back in a Yan'an period. And so I wanted to ask, studying this 17-year period, what are the lessons we can take away when we look at the film industry today? And what are the patterns that you see, the ebbs and flows that are coming back? And I would just love to hear your reflections on Chinese cinema 2021 vis-a-vis what we already know about the 17 years.
Well, that's a big one. I think that one of the things that really defined, some of the ideological struggle of the 17 years was the idea of ambiguity. if you see cinema as simply a tool in your box for helping to create the new Chinese society, why do you want a film to be ambiguous? You want a film to have a clear, direct message, which is why in that second Yan'an period, war films were so useful. Because in fact, there was never a question, who the enemy was in World War II, who the enemy was during the Civil War, who was the enemy in the Korean War. No need for that. Whereas when you get into films like, say, in that third period, and you have City by Night, this guy is an industrialist, but he's a good guy and he supports things and whatever. Even Two Stage Sisters, which, as you well know, ends with the bad sister, the sister who has been decadent and run off with a manager and married him and stuff like that, being accepted back into the fold. They forgive her. That was one of the sins. She should have been punished, for the fact that she had really been decadent. So, I like to think that in a way, the problem was that, these films, when they emphasize ambiguity, their, how could you say, usefulness, in terms of propaganda, to use that loaded term, or just usefulness in terms of this idea of creating a certain vision of China and stuff like that, goes down. That's why I think it's very important at the end that the director general turns to us. He doesn't turn to any authority. He turns to the audience and says, see, this is, in a certain way, he has that direct communication. He doesn't have to sort of bring in the opinion of the above, the party. It's interesting to compare it to another film, I'm sure Breaking with Old Ideas, which was, the classic sort of Cultural Revolution film made in 1975, where that film simply ends with a letter from Mao. They get a letter from Mao, and that's it. There's nothing to question. You know exactly what to do. Here it's a little more ambiguous. And I think that's the quality about the better films of this period that I sort of really treasure. Even if you look at, Red Detachment of Women, it's a very rich and complex film. It's just not a straight propaganda piece.
Thank you. So let's move to some of our audience questions. Yiping Zhou had his hand raised, or her hand raised. I'm not sure the gender, but Yiping, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Are you able to unmute, Yiping?
Can you unmute her maybe, Michael?
I'm trying. I can ask to unmute, but I cannot unmute. Well, let's circle back to Yiping and go to Fengyun, Zhang Fengyun, a PhD student here at UCLA in the film department. Fengyun, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor Barry, and also Professor Pena, for the wonderful talk. So I think my question is about the representation of the ethnic minorities in the 17th year films. As you mentioned, Surf, which is extremely problematic when we watch it. Yeah, and also the other examples you showed us during the talk. And also I think I watched a few films during this time period. There are I think one film at the end of the part, there are different people wearing their kind of costumes from different minority groups and dance together. So this kind of image, I was wondering, to what extent do you think those films reflect the social cultural reality of the hinterlands, or it's just a gesture for propaganda? Yeah.
I mean, I frankly think they probably, had some elements of truth, but, the idea was, there are several things going on here. One is this idea of wanting to see China as one. 90%, 85% of China is Han Chinese, but, China's a big place. So that means these minority communities can have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. They're significant groups. Part of this was this idea that we're all together. And, it's interesting to look at the role of the Han Chinese in these films. These films always have at least some Han Chinese characters, and they come as friends, they come as advisors, sometimes there's romance, whatever, between these people. But the ultimate message is that we're all one family. In Five Golden Flowers, I think it's more particular to that, perhaps because of the exigency of the Great Leap Forward, that you not only show, that these people are part of our family, but they're part of our effort. Look at how all these people are working. And look at how we have allowed a woman to become the person with whom you negotiate or, whatever, these plans. So, I mean, it's, again, while it's trying to celebrate these ethnic minorities, it's trying to celebrate the central government. It really wants to say, look at what we've done for these people. They're working, they're prosperous. We respect their customs, their dance, their singing, but they're also part of the national project. So I think that's what it's trying to do. There's another element that certainly one of the ways to break the power of Shanghai was to make cinema truly national. That is, to have filmmaking going on all over China and not be as concentrated as it was and really continued to be in Shanghai. Because again, there was that sense that Shanghai was not to be trusted, or, it was a little too loose with how they treated characters and things like that.
Thank you. I want to circle back to Yiping. Are you able to unmute now?
Maybe Ping could just type their question here.
Yeah, Yiping, if you are unable to unmute, you can always type your question in the Q&A box and we'll circle back. But I'm going to move on to Agnes, our longtime friend and supporter of the center. Agnes, you have the floor.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, I have a very simple question. I was so impressed by your talk. Do you have some references that you could recommend us and you can give to Dr. Barry so we could, read more about it?
Yeah. And again, at least in English, there's not a real study of the 17 years, to my knowledge, right now. I mean, different books like the Chinese National Cinema book, which came out a few years ago, that talks about the 17 years, not, I think, extensively, but you can certainly find information in that. But, to my mind, and maybe Professor Barry knows better, it's still virgin territory. It still hasn't really been looked at with the kind of, I think, precision that you need to look at it. There is, I think, a British book that was sort of on the period, but can't think of the title now.
Yeah, Agnes, I can follow up with you with a short bibliography. I don't know of any monographs that, like Professor Pena said, that just focus on this period, but there's certainly a lot of books that have chapters on it or various aspects of this period.
The director who I mentioned, the director of Two Stage Sisters, Changjin, there has been some writing on his work. There's a moment in the 1980s where, there was real interest in his work, but, with Changjin, the sad story is that, he was 40 years old when he made Two Stage Sisters, really at the height of his creative powers. And he was, of course, disgraced during the Cultural Revolution, sent to work on a farm, and didn't come back to filmmaking until the early 70s, where a few years he had to film model operas, and didn't make, to my mind, another personal film until 1980, when he made The Legend of Chunyun Mountain, which is, I think, another really terrific film. But, when Chinese cinema was discovered, it wasn't really, people respected him, but it was, of course, the fifth generation. This is what they wanted to see. And he was a throwback from 20 years ago in terms of his filmmaking style and whatever. So a little bit of a tragic story, because I think he never got his due, nor at a moment when, to my mind, he was at the height of his powers. He was forbidden from making films, or at least personal films, for at least 15, 16 years.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. For our next question, I'm going to turn to Carrie Brogan. For those who don't know Carrie, she was actually probably one of the most prolific and best-known Western actors working in the Chinese film industry for the last 15 years or so, I think, more or less. And so she's someone who's very familiar with the contemporary Chinese film scene. So, Carrie, I'll turn it to you.
Hi, thank you, Professor Barry and Professor Pena. It's really an honor to meet you, although virtually. And I so much appreciate the talk tonight. It'll bring so much, I think, illumination to this period that really has not been discussed and put under the microscope. And so I had a question. I was struck by the the comedy clip that you had that was towards the beginning. And I do apologize because I came in sort of towards the end, and I've just come out of a really big surgery. So I don't recall the name of the clip. But what struck me about it is that it was very similar to the comedy that's performed on stage in China at in the current period of time, so maybe even the past 10 years or so. And I was wondering if you had any main takeaways about comedy during this era that you're looking more closely at. And from my own experience, after having, let's say I was there for about 12 years and 50 or 60 TV shows and films, and we always yearned for more comedy. And then just around the Olympics, the 2008 Olympics, before and after, there were several comedies that came out both in television and film. And there was almost a feeling of letting up in the culture itself and amongst the people. And so to me, it just spoke volumes, and it seemed that there were going to be more and more comedies that were emerging and making money, changing the market and the direction of what films in China, were aiming to achieve. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of your reflection on this period and how comedy, this period, the different, I'm so sorry, I've just come out of anesthesia from a really big surgery, so forgive me. But the basically, if you have any takeaways about, the highlights of comedy in that period and what it says about the couple of years that those highlights were and how it reflects on changes of the society at that time. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I wish I could say that I had much more of an encyclopedic knowledge of this period than I probably pretend that I have. But, certainly I think the way it works in the films of Liu Ban, if you've ever seen the film Crossroads, he plays Zhao Dan's sidekick. He was an actor as well as a director, and then he moved into direction. In a way, I think the great thing about what I call the third period, the 100 Flowers period, was really for the first time quite a lot of Chinese films, contemporary Chinese films, focused on contemporary China. Because before that, it was a lot easier to talk about the war or talk about the past or something like that. People were a little nervous about what do you say about a society that's changing. How do you know you're not going to rub somebody's nose the wrong way? But once the 100 Flowers period came along, you do have a number of these comedies that come out. Comedy is a way of sort of deflecting, if that's the right word, social criticism. Clearly a film like Before the New Director Arrives is about a certain kind of class or group of Chinese who have used their positions of authority, if not so much to enrich themselves, to have somewhat of a better life. For example, it's not well explained in what you saw, but you see at one point all these young men moving into an office. What basically happened is the new director has said, I don't need an office this big, I'll have a small office. You have crowding in the dormitory, move in here. And that's what happens. So, in a certain way, you could say that the film is pointing out problems of the new Chinese society, but they're personal problems. They're problems of people. If we just got rid of this guy, things will work well, because it's not the system that is under interrogation. It's just some people who act within the system. Now, even that was considered very hot at the time, but this is, I think, the way that comedy, was able to function at that period as a way in which you could have small, limited, if you will, criticisms of what was going on. Jin, the one who made Two Stage Sisters, directed something called Big Lee, Little Lee, and Old Lee. And that film is about three workers in a factory. And it's a little bit about, it's kind of a satire on boosterism, workers who are a little too enthusiastic, who, want to, first we'll work 8 hours, then we'll do calisthenics, and then we'll do, and other people saying, let me go home. I want to rest. And, it was, again, a very popular film, I think partly because it just showed that, yes, we're all in this, but we also need time to cool out, to be with our wives, to, all those kinds of things. So these are again, I wouldn't want to call them criticisms, but their way of just pointing out that even though we're all behind the socialist project, there are still kind of little problems that crop up every now and then that we should attend to.
Thank you. And thank you, Carrie, for the question. And I think I speak for all of us, wishing you a speedy recovery
Yes,
from your
absolutely.
surgery.
Thank you. Thank you.
And a little follow-up from Agnes's question. We did have a note from Amrasana, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, of other sources. And so just very briefly, there is Jiayi Wang's Revolutionary Cycles in Chinese Cinema, 1951 to 1979, which was published in 2014, and Jessica Kai Chan's Chinese Revolutionary Cinema, Propaganda, Aesthetics, and Internationalism, 1949 to 66, which was
That's
just
the
published.
British, that's the one I was thinking of. Yeah, didn't know the name of it. Thank you for reminding me. Could you say that first one again?
It is authored by Jiayi Wang, entitled Revolutionary Cycles in Chinese Cinema, 1951 to 1979.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And let's turn now to Cui Zhou, who is a doctoral candidate at UCLA in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. And she's actually writing about minority cinema during this period.
Great.
So Cui?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor Barry. And also thank you for Professor Pania's wonderful talk. Even though I'm working on ethnic minority films, my question seems to have no relationship with that topic. My question is about the invisible power. I will call it as the invisible power, such as the global or the whole world. For example, I like what you said about how you separate the 17 years into the Shanghai period and Yan'an period. And of course, we know that Shanghai got a lot of influence from Hollywood. So I treat Hollywood as one of the invisible power behind Shanghai base. And then in terms of what you call the Yan'an period, based on my understanding, it seems like the Changjin Film Studio, so in the north, right? And as I know, Changjin Film Studio got a lot of influence from Manchukuo. So there are a lot of Japanese filmmakers stayed there and helped them to produce Chinese films. So this is, for me, is the other invisible power in China. So I was wondering, how do you interpret these invisible powers? How did they directly or indirectly engage with the game between politics and filmmaking in socialist China? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
It's a very interesting and kind of broad question. Let me just say about Shanghai and Hollywood. I mean, I think there are certain ways that Hollywood film style and whatever were extremely influential on how Chinese filmmakers, Shanghai filmmakers worked. I've always argued, and I've seen few counterexamples, that even though so many of these people were leftists and even communists, just amazingly little influence from Soviet cinema. You know, there's really not a lot of editing that goes on or kind of really dynamic montage, all the things we associate with Soviet cinema. In fact, I think the influence of American cinema was, for better or worse, America was the symbol of the modern. And I think a lot of these Shanghai filmmakers and artists and intellectuals were modernizers. They wanted modern China. And there's nowhere that was more modern in 1949 than the United States. So in a certain way, the US always kind of had that sort of spirit, you know, hanging over it. When I first met Changjin in 1985, he came, I was working at the Art Institute of Chicago, and he came, and I'd sent him a letter saying, oh, if there are any films you'd like to see while you're here, let me know. I'll do my best to arrange it. And he sent me a list of about 20 films from the 1930s. You know, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Make Way for Tomorrow. This was his cinema. He loved those films. You know, that for him was the height of filmmaking, those kind of Hollywood social dramas, you know, and I think it was very influential on that whole generation in a certain way. I'm not too sure about what you mentioned about the Manet films. I mean, they weren't really widely seen anywhere in China. You know, again, they were shown in Manchuria, but in Manchukuo, and of course they were popular in Japan, but they didn't really make their way around, you know, from all that I've learned about it, and I'm limited in terms of my language skills, to other parts of China. So that seems a little bit more of a stretch for me in a way. I don't know if that answers all your questions, because your question was really quite interesting, but quite broad. So I'm trying to think if I answered all edges of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the for the answers. And I know that you showed a film clip from Lü Ban, right? The first film clip, and
Yes.
I think one of the actor, Pu Ke, he was trained in Mang'an. So it seems like there is a kind of connection.
Yeah.
Yes.
No,
Yeah,
I I didn't know that. I'm really happy to hear that.
yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Cui. And we have another graduate student from UCLA, Ziwei Liu. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Barry, and hello, Professor Pena. Because I personally am really interested in reception of film. So I just wonder if you can briefly talk about like audiences at that time, especially the minority people, how they reacted to those minority representations in these films, if there is any evidence, because I guess, at least from my perspective, those films didn't, a distance from their real lives. And as you see, like minority people speak in Mandarin, that definitely is not a realistic picture of. I'm really curious about like how like minority people at that time they react to these films.
Yeah, I it's a very interesting question, and unfortunately, I can't really answer it. I think it would require obvious skills to go in and see how they responded to it. But I think you point out, which is what is real, is that these films weren't really meant for the minority people. These were films for the Han people, for the Han people to sort of in a certain way celebrate how they felt they were treating their minorities. To give a certain slightly different spin, the film Horse Thief, which is kind of an interesting modernist answer to the minority film, there was a version done in Tibetan, but the Chinese government would not export it. They, insisted that wherever the film was shown, it would be spoken in Putonghua. Why? It's ridiculous. This film that's about, Tibetan culture and whatever, and yet all these people are speaking perfect Chinese. Again, for the foreign audience, they wouldn't know the difference, but I at least knew that they weren't speaking Tibetan. And, that was one of the issues that I think has come up even recently with the work of people like Jia Zhengke and others. He's been using local, Michael knows this better than I do, local dialect. I hate to use that word dialect, but local forms of Chinese. And that's become a problem. They want everyone speaking Putonghua without these kind of variations. So the use of language in Chinese cinema is a fascinating topic. In the 1930s, why do you have all these Shanghai films where nobody speaks Shanghainese? It's again one of those issues that crops up throughout the history of Chinese. But again, so many of us in the West don't realize how differently Chinese is spoken throughout China. We think there's one language. And of course, you all know far better than I do that there certainly is, or more than one way of speaking Chinese.
Thank you. If Professor Pena is willing to entertain maybe one or two more.
I'm delighted. I'm at your service.
Let's turn to Armasana. I hope I pronounced your name okay.
Yes, thank you. It's Armasana. Yeah. Thank you for the very wonderful talk, both Professor Richard Pena and Professor Barry. Okay, there's a construction site going on very near to me, so I might broke off. If in that case, I'll just type my question later. I have two questions. One is very short, factual question. That is, how much of the cinema from this period, the films from this period, are available now at all? And the second question is that this is really a continuation of what Professor Barry commented. Like, I think I really also see that how the cinema of now is almost like reflecting or retracting the cinema of the 17-year period in many ways, as Professor Barry has mentioned, with the release of all the very huge popularity of films like Battle of Lake Changjin. And
Are you still there?
We can hear you. You can keep going.
Oh no, did we lose Amarasana?
I think maybe he muted himself because there's a lot of background noise at the moment.
Yeah.
Maybe do you want to go ahead, Richard, and answer the first part of his question first?
Sure. Yeah. Again, thank you for the nice words. you know, in a way, when you ask what's available, very, very little. I mean, my odyssey with this was quite literally about 2000. I thought, gee, what a good idea. Let's do something about the 17 years when I was at Lincoln Center. And I went to China and went to the Beijing Film Archive and was basically told, oh, you know, these are very old films. They're in terrible condition. We haven't really done. And it was just clear they didn't want to show those films, that these were films that they'd rather forget about, you know, or you know, other than maybe Shijin and a couple of others. So it didn't happen. So I would, you know, as I was in constant touch back then, you know, through my job at Lincoln Center with China, I would bring it up again and again. And you know, usually very politely, they would tell me no. And then finally, about 2009, when Fu Hongxing became the director of the Beijing Film Archive, you know, I said to him, you know, one of my dreams has been to do, and he said, sure, when do you want to do it? You know, so I said, how about next year? Sure, great. You know, what do you want to show? So, you know, so I had a list, but then I went back and I, you know, saw more film, and I spoke to people. Obviously, there were people who far more about it than I did, and they recommended films. So in the 2010 New York Film Festival, we did a kind of program on the 17 years. I think we showed 14 or 15 films. From that, I was able to get DVDs of a few of these films, which I now have for my teaching purposes. But that's really about it. I mean, you know, maybe you can find on the internet. Again, so much turns up nowadays that you can never hold, you know, control it, maybe on YouTube or something like that. But it's not an area that's been put out, you know. I mean, there was a plan a long time ago when I was in touch with people at Criterion, and they really want to get interested in Chinese cinema. And I talked them into sort of saying, well, we do like a 5-film box set on the 17 year. Oh, what a great idea. And then nothing happened. So, I mean, what can I say? You know, we've been trying. And, you know, and let me just say, I think, you know, Shijin for me is a great filmmaker. You know, I think it's a fascinating period and a very revealing period. You know, I think in terms of cinema, there's a general quality, level of quality, but you know, I think it's not like you're going to discover a whole bunch of Chen Kai-ges or Jia Shanges or anyway. They're good working filmmakers, and you know, they're working under tremendous pressure because nobody knew what was gonna, you know, if you said something they wouldn't like. You know, if you showed something that suddenly was seen as being, you know, reactionary, or you used an actor who, you know, someone mentioned before, an actor who worked in Manchuria, that's the kind of thing that could completely scuttle a film. You know, do you realize that guy worked with the Japanese? Whew, that would be it. You know, so it was a very tense time. It couldn't have been easy to be a filmmaker back then because you always had to look over your shoulder and look to right and left and whatever, because you just weren't sure what the new dictate would be.
Thank you. Armasana, can you ask the second question, part of your question now?
I'll try real fast now. Yeah. So anyway, the popularity of these films, like the so-called main melody films, like right. Battle at Changjin Lake, and also like even with like national ethnic minority cinema, now it's almost in a very like, how to say, cold kind of like area. In Chinese you say lemma, right? It's not well studied enough because there's not many that are made in this kind of cinema, right. With the exception of Tibetan cinema, obviously. And also even with like, you know, foreign films back in like 17-year period, I have said, you could basically see none of them, even from the Eastern European bloc. And so now in China, like in year 2020 and 2021, you know, there's also like a lot of Chinese foreign films, especially Hollywood, big blockbuster productions that are not being shown in China for many reasons. Like my very naive mind was even imagining that at the beginning of this pandemic, that because cinemas everywhere else were closed, maybe they would even get a very early release in China, but that has not been the fact at all. So yeah, basically, like what I'm asking is like, what, as you're obviously very familiar with like history of Chinese film in general, like even the current form. So I'm just trying to ask, like, what do you think is like now taking shape? Like, what is the future for like Chinese cinema, not as not just as like art form, but also maybe as like an industry and to more reception and exhibition side of it. Yeah, thank you.
It is hard because cinema has changed so much. I mean, I understand what you say about how, certainly not a lot of American or certainly not a lot of other non-American films are shown in China. And yet I've taught in China. I've had the great pleasure of doing that a few times. And I've had students in my class who have seen every film of Bela Tarr. They've been able to see this great Hungarian filmmaker and a lot of other things, every film of Hal Hartley. People find a way. And that's, I think, something now. So it's hard to really look at official exhibition in that way because, the exhibition doesn't show very much outside of Hollywood blockbusters and Chinese commercial films. But somehow these films sort of have their way of making their rounds, in the Chinese community. In terms of the future, I don't know. In a certain way, there are two questions. What is the future of cinema and what's the future of Chinese cinema? And both of them, I think, are still kind of up in the air. I recently gave a talk actually in China about the Squid Game, which is not something I think I would ever talk about, but I, was asked to do something, a talk that would deal with, Asian production in the United States. And curiously, my argument was that the success of Squid Game and Parasite is, I think, somewhat based on the fact that these are films that are saying things no American film would say. That in ways, I think these films are so anti-capitalist. There's such critiques of contemporary society that I think American filmmakers would be hesitant to make work so strong. But if they're in South Korea, maybe there's enough distancing that allows Americans and others, to accept it because they see it as coming from somewhere else. But they're actually, I think awfully critical works of, contemporary society. So that would be the, a smaller part. I just hope that Chinese cinema just continues in its wonderful diversity. I have nothing against Chinese commercial films. I don't find them very interesting, but hey, they're not for me. But as long as other films can be made, that's what I'm mostly interested in. As long as the filmmakers who I admire can still make works, in liberty and without fear and, be able to send those films other places, that's fine for me. Because why shouldn't a country like China have a huge number of types of films, including very commercial films that, again, have no interest for me, but who cares? They're not made for me. They're made for Chinese audiences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for the question.
And I think Carrie had one final follow-up question. Carrie?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Professor Berry. I was hoping to hear a final thought on the earlier clip that you showed in which the actor came forward and spoke to the audience.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate just a little bit on how common that was during this unique 17-year period? Was it there throughout? It seems it may have been drawn a bit from Peking opera. It's possible.
Good point.
Yeah, and if it wasn't common throughout, was there a turning point when it suddenly was featured? And if so, what does that speak to? Thank you.
Excellent question and interesting comment about Chinese opera, which after all is really presentational as opposed to representational. Performers are fully aware that they're being looked at by an audience, and the audience is fully aware of the fact that people are not who they're supposed to be. They're, presenting these images or these characters. I can't say it's very common. It's also in Liu Ban's other film, Unfinished Comedy. They do that a couple of times, make audience address. It's something you find sometimes in not only Chinese, but other comedy. Here, my point about it was that at the moment when the director, the guy who's the real director, wants to establish authority, he turns to the audience in a very democratic gesture. I see it as where he's basically saying, you and we believe this, as opposed to just me. And that's interesting because, especially in the Cultural Revolution, of course, all authority would flow upwards and you would just wait for what Mao thought. Or the Gang of Four or something like that. So it's interesting at this moment in the 50s, not 10 years after 1949, there is this sense of the party representing the voice of the people, so that's how I read that, that what he does is basically turn to the people and in a certain way grant them the final authority for him cashiering this guy, but that's how I read it.
Wow. Yeah. It resonates with the Qi movement that came about around 2015. And Qi means I guess one with the people, or more in touch with the common person, Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate the lecture today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Richard. And one thing, I don't know if the audience realizes the kind of deep and almost encyclopedic knowledge that Professor Pena demonstrated about Chinese cinema today. He can do that with a dozen other national cinemas: Iranian cinema, Hungarian cinema, Cuban cinema. I mean, his breadth of knowledge is just so impressive. So I encourage you to seek out other writings and attend other lectures that Professor Pena gives. He's just such a treasure, and we're so happy that he was able to share his knowledge with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I was so delighted and honored to be invited by you, Michael, and congratulations on all your great work. It makes us all very proud that we knew you when. So
thank you.
Thanks very much. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.
And may I just mention, if you have any additional questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. My email is RAP, then the number 4 @columbia.edu. So please, any questions or anything I can try and help you with, just don't hesitate to write.
Thank you for sharing that. And finally, as our last event of the quarter, I want to thank again Assistant Director Esther Joe, who behind the scenes makes so much of what we do possible. Thanks to all of the donors who support the center. We just appreciate all of you being there with us throughout this quarter, and hopefully we'll see you at future events next quarter. So thanks again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Michael.
Bye. Thank you.